Hey everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel where we learn to be a better programmer. In this video, I'm going to give you 3 tips to study for your FANG interview. Before we get started, be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on post notifications so you don't miss out on future videos. So the interview process at FANG companies, while rigorous, is actually very transparent. Like if you want to interview at Google, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Twitter, all these places, it's very straightforward. There's like some sort of algorithm, data structures and algorithms questions that they ask you. And then there might be some systems design questions and so on. Okay. So how do you prepare for these interviews? So historically, or what you might read online is, do all the leak code problems that you can possibly do all the HackerRank problems you can possibly do, and then you'll get in. And that's just not true, honestly. If you can solve those problems, great, like that's awesome. But there's also these other things that you also need to understand about writing software, right? So, and I think that only comes from actually building things that you need to use those skills that you gain in leak code to solve, right? So, for example, in some of the questions that I got, disclaimer, I'm not going to give you specific questions I got at Google because I signed an NDA, and I think everyone needs to have a fair shot to interview at these places. So when I wrote some code on my own to build a side project or something, I had to make it pretty efficient in terms of like if I ran it if I implemented an inefficient algorithm, it wouldn't like run in the time frame that I needed it to run, right? And that's an example of like a parallel to, all right, you implement something in leak code, but there's no context of why that's important, right? So I implemented this thing and it was slow, and I was like, all right, I need to figure out like how to make this run faster, right? So I sat down, I wrote down on some paper like how to make this work faster and so on and so forth. And then I found like the equivalent of a dynamic programming sort of solution to the problem, but it wasn't like, I didn't think of it as like dynamic programming, for example. And that a similar problem to the problem that I actually solved in building this thing was actually something that I got in my interview, right? So it was very interesting that like I did all these leak code problems, and the one thing that I took when I got to the interview, the one thing that actually helped me was doing some obscure problem solving for some side project that I actually needed to implement, right? So yeah, you can solve all the leak code problems you want, but there might not, you're basically increasing the probability that you've already seen the problem, right? So for example, like if you build something, you might actually get the same benefit as doing like 1,000 leak code problems. So it's just kind of an interesting side effect there. Another thing, so that's problem number 1 is like data structures and algorithms. Yes, leak code is useful, but also try building hard things, building complex things that require you to think about your implementation details and understand like the right way to go about doing something so that your code will actually work and run more efficiently. Okay, so that's number 1. Number 2 is for most of these web companies like Google, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, they are all web-based companies, right? So they all handle requests, responses, and dealing with that whole life cycle, right? So the second big tip is building a full stack web application. So what that looks like, build a client that communicates with a server that saves data to a database, okay? And then you may encounter some problems there that might help you in a systems design interview, right? So like, all right, so if you built a full stack web application, you might not have had to scale it to Google, Facebook, or Amazon levels, but you may have had to implement a load balancer, or you may have had to implement multiple application sharding, application servers. You may have had to implement a sharding scheme to make sure that your servers are handled. If one server goes down, the request for a particular person isn't dropped. Okay, you might have had to implement database sharding and other instances like that. So there's these things that you can gain understanding of without needing to like actually work at these places, right? And your understanding will get refined if you work at these places for sure, but it will definitely prepare you better for these interviews other than just like reading a book or just like, watching a YouTube video on like how to build Uber, right? Like, okay, so all right, what you're basically doing is you're trying to make sure, like, if you get an Uber question, if if you get a question at one of these interviews that's like, oh, how do you design Uber? Oh yes, I already saw that, so I can ace this. That's not really the way to go about things. Yeah, sure, that's a fantastic way of doing things, but like honestly, as an interviewer, and I see you like implement the perfect Uber solution, it's like, do you really understand what's going on here, or are you just copying and pasting in your mind exactly what you saw in a YouTube video? All right, so like we can see through these things, so that's kind of an important thing. Okay, and then the third thing is ultimately you still do have to do like, you still have to read Cracking the Coding interview. You still have to understand data structures and algorithms. You still have to code on a whiteboard just to get practice, to get more comfortable. And then you also just have to practice talking out your thought process. I think the biggest thing that I see when I interview candidates is they don't talk enough. There's a lot of stuff, they assume that we already know what they're thinking. They assume like a lot of stuff is going on that like isn't necessarily true. And it's important to understand what your thought process is and clarify with your interviewer what you're thinking, and then that way we can get in sync with what you're trying to accomplish. So those are the three things that I think those are the three ways I think are best to study for an interview. Is yes, leak code, but also build hard things, like so maybe try to implement some machine learning algorithms from scratch, or maybe try to just build something really complicated. I don't know. Build a full stack web application. I think that is underrated in terms of like the things that you're going to need to understand to implement that from end to end. And then lastly, just like the practice of like doing whiteboard stuff, talking about your thought process and all that kind of thing. Okay, so I hope you liked the video. If you did, hit that like button and feel free to subscribe and turn on post notifications so you don't miss out on future videos. Thanks so much.